Welcome to Get Moving TV. I'm Dr. Chris Landon. I serve as your host. Sometimes I'll go to social events. I really try not to get out very often. And the guests, you know, they're fun to talk to, but on occasion, there's one that just leaps out. We were talking a little bit about just the student kind of productions we do here, and he'd gotten involved with KCLU. With me today is John North, winner of now his 5th Golden Mike Award. So, John, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much.
I know this is
that party was good.
Oh, it's a great party.
Yeah.
Is this your first time in front of a camera? Because you've been the voice of radio for...
No, I did some TV reporting for about 4 years during the mid-'80s, but always went back to radio. I never could become accustomed to television for some reason. So that was at KCOP, Channel 13 in Los Angeles.
Well, one of the things they do here is they train people. That's really their job, and we want people to develop different careers, and radio, I think, is now more going on to the internet. Were you involved in anything particular in radio, maybe something innovative?
Well, actually, I broke into radio in radio news in 1961. I had worked in radio for 3 years prior to that as what passed for rock and roll disc jockey in those days, the late 50s, the Buddy Holly era, et cetera, et cetera. And then got married. We had a daughter, moved to San Diego, and couldn't find a job. Couldn't get arrested if I, ran down Broadway. So finally, one day I saw an ad in the paper, or my wife did, help wanted news announcer. Telephone number to call, so I called. Make a long story short, there was an audition given for 8 to 10 news anchors at the Mission Valley Inn in San Diego, and this was very early in 1961. My audition consisted of reading 2 stories off the front page of the San Diego Union newspaper, and then reading those into a microphone. Got the job. We were not told what station we were going to work for. So we all had a meeting after everybody had been hired, after they'd hired the initial anchor staff. And we got into this room, and this man stood up and said, "Welcome, you are the new anchors for an all-news radio station." And we looked at each other as if, what has this guy been smoking? I mean, all news? Who's going to listen to all news 24/7? A lot of people did, and a lot of people still do. So that was the beginning of Extra News. Our marketing promotion was Extra News over Los Angeles. We were 10 to 15 miles outside of Tijuana, Mexico, in an old Quonset hut. And a couple of stories about the old Quonset hut. The front door sometimes didn't close. The caretaker kept goats. One time I turned around from the anchor desk during a commercial break and was staring face to face with a goat. There was also the time that a big snake entered the studio. So we had a few visitors down there, but it was an interesting job, and it was the forerunner of what ultimately became KFWB and KNX. And in '68, when they went all news, that put us out of business.
What were your call numbers, just out of curiosity? So
690.
A mighty 690.
The mighty 690, that's what it had been. It had been a big rocker, and the call letters in Spanish were XETRA, XETRA. So we used the term extra news over Los Angeles, when in fact we were over Tijuana. But we had a huge signal. So then I came up to LA.
And what did you do in Los Angeles? How did
I went to work for Metro Media Radio. At that time, it owned KLAC. It was a talk station with people like Joe Pine, Les Crane, Joel A. Spivak, Bob Grant, et cetera, et cetera. I started anchoring the all-night news. They ultimately put me in the field, and one Saturday I'm in the newsroom because we worked 6 days. The 6th day we anchored, the 5 days we were out in the field. And a story broke on the CNS wire, City News Service wire, that there had been a shooting at an estate on Cielo Drive up in the Hollywood Hills. This happened to be Saturday, August 8th, 1969. And as it turned out, it was the first discovery of the Tate LaBianca Charles Manson murder victims. And the next day they discovered Rosemary and Lino LaBianca in their home on Waverly Drive in Los Feliz. Total of 7 victims. LA was terrified. Gun sales went through the roof. People who could afford to were flying out of town as fast as they could. You could not get a locksmith. People were changing the locks on their doors, their cars, their windows, and everything, because headlines in the Times and the Herald Examiner, which was a prominent paper in those days, were that hippie cult wanders LA with guns and knives. Well, so, I mean, it's one thing to have a group of people in the Golden Gate Park in San Francisco strumming guitars and running around with flowers in their hair. It's another thing to have people who look like that, supposedly, allegedly, walking the streets of LA with guns and knives. So anyway, I covered all of the, as a field reporter, I covered all of the preliminary Manson trial appearances, and then covered the entire Charles Manson trial. That started in June of 1970 and lasted for months. The penalty phase of the trial lasted for a couple of months. The trial was a circus. It was pandemonium every day. I mean, I could tell you some stories of that trial that were just, I mean, it was bizarre. It was the true meaning of the word bizarre.
Well, you and I were talking at the party, Charles Manson.
Right.
What did the press corps call him? And maybe a couple bizarre stories
well,
or two might be
usually in a murder trial, you probably will call the defendant by his or her last name. Charlie was what we called Manson. The entire press corps, I don't know how that started, but Charles Manson to the press corps was Charlie did this, Charlie did that. Did you hear what Charlie did? You said that was how we referred to Manson. Leslie Van Houten, Susan Atkins, and Patricia Krenwinkel, the 3 young women who were on trial with Manson, we called the girls. So it was Charlie and the girls. And it was one day, Charles Manson and the 3 women walk into courtroom and they have an X on their forehead. This is not done with a Sharpie. This is done with a butter knife or something that drew blood. The blood is dried. They have an X on their foreheads. They all stand up and announce that they have X'd themselves out of society. And it may well be that they did X one of the defense attorneys out of society, in fact, out of life permanently, a man named Ron Hughes. Manson wanted all of the people, all of the attorneys to represent him. He really didn't care about Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten. Leslie Van Houten, by the way, 2 years before she took part in these murders, had been a homecoming princess at Monrovia High School. So that shows you the transition there from this, what everybody thought was, you know, these average kids that turned into these monsters. But Ron Hughes got into a fight, a verbal fight with Manson at the end of court one day. And Manson very menacingly looked across the counsel table and said, "Attorney, I don't ever want to see you in this courtroom again," in a very loud voice. Most of the reporters were still, you know, packing up the gear and everything to get out of the trial for the day. Well, we never did see him. His body was found in Sesame Hot Springs about 3 or 4 months later. Now, there's no positive evidence that Manson had him killed because his body in those days was too badly decomposed to determine the cause of death. Forensics being what they are today, they probably would have been able to tell how he died. But Van Houten was awarded a new attorney and a new trial with the same conclusion. All of the defendants, Charlie and the 3 girls, were convicted, found guilty, and they were all sentenced to die in the California gas chamber. While they're sitting on death row, the real main demonic killer of all of these 7 people, a man by the name of Charles Tex Watson, who was fighting. He had escaped California, and he was fighting extradition from Texas. While Charlie and the girls were on trial, he was fighting extradition. So he lost his extradition, but the Manson trial was over, so he had his own trial. He was sentenced to death in the gas chamber. And a year after all of them were sentenced to die in the gas chamber, the California Supreme Court overturned the death penalty as cruel and unusual punishment. At that time, there was no sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. That's why, for the past 40+ years, Manson and the female defendants, Susan Atkins passed away from cancer last year. The other two have periodically come up for parole. And they'll never, I mean, who wants to be on the California State Parole Board that grants parole to any member of the Manson family, you know? So anyway, that was the Manson trial.
Well, John, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome.
We look forward to seeing you again. We want you to meet up with Tom Weaver, of course, who's been on the previous show.
I'd like to. Thank you. Thanks, Chris.
Ventura, as you know, it's time to get moving one more time. Get moving to KCLU. Take a listen. You've gotten a chance to hear the voice and see the man. So, Ventura, get moving.